Recession, London and the growing logistics crisis, could a lack of infrastructure hit London's recovery? And what this is really about is, if London is to recover from the pandemic and remain competitive on the global stage, because let's face it, London isn't looking at Bradford, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham. London's competing with the New Yorks of this world. It will need sustainable local jobs. London needs to be cleaner and greener, and London needs a last mile delivery network that is green. Both things that logistics can offer. However, what's the risk? Land earmarked for industrial development in the capital has diminished significantly over the last few years. So the land where the infrastructure goes is under threat, it's diminishing. I don't see anything other than that trend continuing, because logistics is competing against housing, and the government mindset is on housing, and it's forgotten what logistics has to offer in terms of jobs and everything else. And I still think today's Londoners go in and they don't think where their cappuccinos come from when they get out the tube station. They don't think where their prescriptions come from whenever they go to the pharmacy. They don't even think where the sandwiches have turned up at lunchtime, or even the morning newspapers whenever they go into their news agents. I just think back 12 months ago when people started to do baking from home and they couldn't get the baking produce that they needed, how fragile this system is. So just how fragile is the system in London as more and more people are reliant on logistics, because more and more Londoners are abandoning the motor car, and more councils in London are having car-free developments. And it's very green to say, get on your bike, you're not having a parking space, you can't apply for a res park space in London, but that forces people to rely on logistics for their deliveries, because there's not much you can put in your back of your bicycle, and you certainly wouldn't be able to put a microwave oven or a refrigerator on the back of your bicycle. So I'm going to start off with Ollie Bycroft, and when you do chip in on this, if you could just remind people of who you are, what's your name, your job title, and the company that you speak from. And if people could stay on mute until they speak, so don't get a lot of background noise. So we'll start with you, Ollie, and you're from Prologis. You've been on sessions before, so I think everybody knows who you are already. Just how fragile is the system in London?
Yeah. What was that? I'm getting a bit of feedback here. Can everyone hear me okay?
You're fine.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, look, I think, it's an interesting question, and no one quite really knows what the impact will be. I think, as you said, John, even, I think kind of lockdown gave us a glimmer that even, minor shortages on shelves and just things that people take for granted, as soon as that doesn't become available, people get, very, very unsettled very quickly, I think it's fair to say. And that does, in a way, it's been helpful because it does shine a light on this kind of important sector that probably happens largely behind the scenes. I like the way you talked about, your cup of coffee in the morning. People just, typically don't think about how that gets to them, or their sandwiches at lunchtime. Park Royal plays a huge part in getting food to central London for its massive office, contingent of office workers that commute daily in. There's some really big challenges, and I think what happens if there is insufficient supply, and I think there's a few answers to that. And I think you can talk about the jobs. It is an important sector. London might not see it as its most important sector. There's definitely more glamorous sectors, I'm sure. Finance, film and television, whatever, that creative industries that London's known for, but it is a really important mix and a component. The types of jobs that are available. You've got to. We talked about how that's changing, but you've got your warehouse jobs, which are still important in a city like London. Low barriers to entry. People whose first language is in English. These are really good ways to get people into employment and find a career progression. So that's one component, and the other issue is, of course, going to be going to be price and cost to occupiers and those businesses that are in London. One of the drivers for housing growth, the need for more housing, is affordability. Well, industrial and logistics operators have probably experienced the same thing. I can see Andrew's on the panel, so he may have something to say about this. It's good for us as where, if you're in development and landlords, it's brilliant that rents are increasing the way they are. But, how sustainable is that in the long term for occupiers? And ultimately, they'll get pushed out. And before I go on too long, I think another thing I mentioned then is if they're pushed out, and this plays to those that saw the panel before, it can't be good for sustainability and traffic and congestion if all those vehicles are having to come from further away and still get into central. They still have to get in. So much better to have an efficient urban network than big buildings. This sort of a donut formation or trucks coming in from the Midlands every day to serve London. It's not a good sustainable.
Two great big demands there, haven't you? You've got this massive growth areas. People sat at home are so used to now getting their deliveries at home. So that's grown enormously over the last 12 months. And people got used to that, so are accustomed to that. People want next day delivery. In fact, my firm's done some research on, do people want same day deliveries? And that does seem to be the next expectation, is that people are willing to pay more to get same day delivery. So that's where the expectations are in terms of the consumer. You've now got the main office suppliers and businesses waking up in the centre of London. They're all coming back to work now. So you've been focusing on people working from home and providing a service for them, which is still going to stay very high. But as these businesses come back and the demand in the centre of London starts to bounce back up again, and every day I go back into London, the tubes, the buses, the pavements are getting fuller. So London is going back to recovery. You've got to go back to servicing that as well. And can the infrastructure take the new growth you've had from the home consumer and the return back to the expectations of having all that infrastructure, the toilet rolls, the coffee and everything in the centre of London, that's going to be provided. And it has to be done on a daily basis, because I still want a fresh croissant in the morning when I get out the tube. Let's try Andrew. Andrew Wadsworth. What's your view on this, Andrew? Can London cope, or do you think logistics is going to get pushed out further and further away, and it's going to take longer to get goods into London? I think Andrew's gone quiet.
You might just have.
Andrew.
Yeah, got you.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, I think from a DHL perspective, we obviously are servicing London. We've seen that the centre has quietened down considerably over the last 18 months for obvious reasons, but it is starting to ramp up. And we've always found it a struggle to find suitable premises close into the city, the West End, to service it. So the bulk of what we are doing is coming in from a long distance out, really, because the affordability of trying to find realistic space close in is just not there. We have an operating model for our supply chain business as a sort of a regional consolidation type centre, and we've never managed to be able to make that stack up for London, just because the prices aren't there, and the cost of doing these consolidation centres just don't stack up. So we've always found it a challenge to service the centre of London. The parcel side of things is obviously an interesting one as well, because trying to find smaller practical facilities close in as well has also been a challenge. So the property makeup is just not there. So it's the availability of space and the cost of any space that is there are making it prohibitive from a distribution kind of perspective. So that's causing us big issues, really.
The London plan is quite important for this, because it gives the strategic allocations for land uses across London, and the mayor did acknowledge that industrial sites are quite important, so the strategic industrial locations were all protected. But then the Secretary of State stepped in, wouldn't let the plan go through, and made the mayor relax the policies on strategic industrial locations because of the demand for housing. So again, that seems to me that surely, Andrew, is a step in the wrong direction for logistics.
It is, yeah. I got involved in contributing to that London plan as well. So yeah, it is disappointing that it wasn't taken up in its fullest. But I think, as you said, Ollie, where we're at is they want more housing. People who are going to live there are expecting these things to be on their doorstep, but they want it green, they want it efficient, and the two don't mix. You know, the plan that we've got doesn't work with what they're trying to achieve.
Do you think individual local planning authorities, the 33 authorities in London, really understand what logistics are about, or is it just something that happens over there and it just, you know, my crossing arrives and my paper arrives in the morning, I don't need to worry about it? So do you think the planners are aware that we're heading towards a crisis in London?
There might be some who are. I suppose we can't tarnish them all with the same brush, but the way it seems to be going, you would say probably not, but because of the plans that they're putting in place. We're finding it harder and harder, as you say, to find suitable space. Yeah, we're trying to come up with all these clever ways around putting it on the river, low energy vehicles, that sort of thing. With it, will there be sufficient power wherever you do find places to actually go for the green agenda, where you're going to have these electric vehicles closer in? Will there be sufficient power to charge them? That sort of thing as well. There's lots of challenges. So yes, I think it needs seriously looking at again.
John, I'd just sort of come in there. You know, to my mind, you always, you know, you do have this with a fragmented kind of, you know, local authorities that might all have, you know, their own reasons, and, you know, not saying that they don't ever look to the greater good, but, you know, their principal concern is their constituents and what happens within their boundaries, and that's where the London plan really ought to be coming in to prioritise and provide, you know, London-wide policy which needs to be adhered to, and that is why it was slightly disappointing that you know that the safeguarding of industrial was eroded at that level. But you know, for me, the London plan gets, you know, in a way is got too detailed in parts, and taking away some of the detail that the local authorities ought to be doing, or overlapping, which creates conflict and inconsistency in areas. But first and foremost, you know, that the London plan should be a high-level policy document to make sure that, you know, policy is appropriate for London as a whole and not just specific borough boundaries.
Okay. Well, Jonathan Langham has put a question. I don't know, Jonathan, whether you want to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. I think it's to do with beds over sheds. Jonathan, do you want to join in the debate? Don't be shy.
Certainly try. Sort of, there's so many screens and different buttons to press. It's a puzzle to know the right one. Thank you. So my name's Jonathan Langham. I'm head of commercial development for Be First. So we're effectively the property division of London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, and I suppose we're a microcosm of the problem. So we've got acres of allocated sill land, and we've got a massive housing problem. And the compromise is to mix beds and sheds to solve the problem. And I guess my role is to try to broker the situation. And my background has come from a sort of institutional shed side of things. So I like sheds. I'm not very keen on residential, but kind of conscious we all have to compromise. So I suppose my dilemma, and the bit I'm quite interested to get a view on, is we're focusing on a couple of projects which is going to be new build stock, and there's lots of examples elsewhere in London where you can recycle old industrial floor space for maker space, and you can mix that with residential, and you create these lovely sort of hubs. But we're probably at the hard end of the market where we're doing new build schemes. So to get an investor to build new stock, it's got to be robust, credible, and institutional. And there is an aspiration to mix beds and sheds. So the solution we have to sort of get around the capacity problem is we have a commercial uses on the ground floor, podium deck, and then residential above. And as everybody on the panel probably knows, your build cost for bog standard shed is £100 a square foot. For multi-story, it starts at 150 and goes up. And basically, your rents don't really work until you're sort of north of 18 or £20 a square foot. But we're being forced to a situation where the planners want commercial uses at ground floor, residential above. And to my mind, we just end up with a compromise of everything. We end up with bad commercial floor space, and we end up with bad residential floor space. So I'm desperately trying to come up with a solution where I re-provide institutional stock, ground floor, single story, 10 metre eaves height, which I can build cheaply, and then I separate my residential. But fundamentally, I end up with a shortfall because I haven't got enough land. So my only sort of safety valve is to then do multi-story commercial floor space, which can work. And we're speaking to a couple of operators, and there's a few people on the call and know the names. If we get a big institutional investor that sort of wants to sort of do managed floor space, that could just about work, and then we could generate a hub. But I suppose the question that's probably come over as a little bit muddled. I suppose my question to the market is, what do you want us to build? Because I'd kind of like to get a very clear view that you want unencumbered floor space, and you want big boxes, and you don't want compromised floor space with lots of columns, etc., etc., etc. And if I do provide that, it'll sit there vacant, and then the whole thing gets compromised, and we end up having to recycle it. So, I'll open the debate. So it's really, we'd love to get a steer of what the market wants and how that market will change over time, which it will do in terms of costs going up and intensification, etc.
Well, I think that's a very good question, Jonathan. We're going to pull in Tom Alexander in a moment, who's just joined us, but I'm going to first of all bounce back to Ollie on this one, Ollie, because I'm a planner by profession, and I think I'd probably represent the views of most chief planners sitting in their individual boroughs thinking, we've got a problem here, we've got to provide a lot of new flats. There's this logistics, guys. I know the solution. You build your logistics on the ground floor, we'll build a load of flats above it. So what's the answer to that? Ollie, why can't we do that?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you came to me because I was itching to answer that. We understand, we understand the logic in why beds and sheds feels like a really good idea. And I'm not saying that it has no place. But I think the reality is when you look at, logistics and industrial is a vast generalization of all types of uses. And, the heart of industrial logistics and where the real pressure is at the moment is very intensive uses, 24/7 operation. Andrew will tell you, if you have hours of use restrictions, you're immediately massively narrowing your market to the extent that Prologis wouldn't invest in the location where we need to consider hours of use restrictions, because it would just kill our tenant demand. And that is fundamentally the real problem. I'd say that there are examples that are like builders yards and sort of quasi retail type uses that can work in a beds and sheds scenario. And the thing with hours of use restrictions is that they can be put on it retrospectively. So even though you built flats with industrial below and everyone can see that, if that operation keeps them awake 24/7, that hours of use restriction can come on retrospectively. So that's a risk that we wouldn't take as a business. And another point there is that it's probably safe to say that when you look at the value, how that value proposition stacks up, all the values in the retail, 80% of your cost and value is going to be residential, and small proportion is going to be industrial. So I don't think the major industrial providers are going to enter that space, it's going to be residential developers. And if I was being a little bit cynical, we've seen this before with residential, that they will provide some industrial on the ground floor, but in their appraisals they can put a value of 0 on it. It doesn't really matter whether it lets or not. That's not a component of their value proposition. And if I was being even more cynical, you might find that in a couple of years it sort of converts very nicely into some additional residential on the ground floor. So that's one. I think that's one component. So, but I do see a way where you can have it side by side. So you can have them close together, but I think you need vertical. You need separation of the two uses. And multi-story or high density is something that we're looking really closely at. And I think as the sector evolves, that might also become, multi-story might become easier. Challenge at the moment is getting big HGVs up floors is difficult, costly, as you said, columns and the like. So it's something that we're looking at, or a high density solution. And I would sort of encourage you to look much more in that direction. Just one other thing about fencing sheds would just be around fire risk. We mentioned Grenfell. We've looked at it, but we're really worried about that. And I don't know. I don't think the government. I would love the government to come out and say, perhaps they need to look at it and say, yeah, there's a solution here, because we think, insurance-wise, fire risk-wise, it's an absolute complete nightmare to put the types of uses that you'll have in industrial buildings above tall blocks of residential in the current climate. That's a real issue that someone needs to solve.
I think fires are very much prevalent in people's minds, I've got to say. I'm going to try and Tom Alexander. Now, Tom has posted in the chat room that he's interested in working on hybrid designs of industrial and other uses in urban locations. So, Tom, you'll have heard what the guys have had to say so far. What's your view on multi-story logistics and mixing residential and other uses with logistics as a solution? Bearing in mind high land values are probably the only way is up. Can it be achieved?
Yeah, no, hello, Tom Alexander. I'm a director of Orchid Swanky. We're architects, and we've been looking at this challenge for quite a long time now. We were invited by SEGRO actually several years ago to explore the idea. And so we've been exploring it ever since. I've met some people from Prologis as well, Ollie, so good to meet you. And we've chatted with you guys about it before as well. And obviously there are some major challenges, of course, and that's what you've got to overcome. And I think the media picked up on it and started calling it beds on sheds straight away and thought it was a great slogan, and that was all good fun. But it's not really what we're doing. We're integrating, and we're finding ways of basically getting the best out of the available land that's there. So our approach is always completely fundamentally, you cannot compromise on the industrial and you cannot compromise on the residential, and you need to blend them together with public realm, so that you're integrating that industrial community and the people who work there in the local community, in the local neighborhood, so that people who live and work in that, if you like, a 15-minute sort of quarter can get on with each other really well and benefit from each other. So then you get into all the kind of technical issues. Are you literally putting residential on top of a superstructure roof for a shed, or are you integrating those structures in a clever way so they're a bit more touching? There's a vertical party wall. It's the horizontal party wall that it gets complicated and costly, and all those issues start to emerge. So we're very much looking more and more at ones which have still got a vertical party wall, but it's like a terraced house, and then you're dealing with vibration and sound and access and visibility. But we find that the industrial uses are often have a part of them can be shared visually from the street side. So not all of it, it's private, it's secret perhaps, but certainly where the people work, maybe there's a bit of R&D, maybe there's a bit of display space, and you can have a front window onto the same side of street where you've got a residential entrance, and it becomes animated and active. It's like a workplace of different types. And to be honest, when we first started looking at it, it was quite challenging, but we've now looked at over 40 sites across London. Loads more out, even we're going out to brownfield sites out of town and looking at more side by side. And once we get over the hurdle of integrating the industrial into a residential community, you can then find practical, physical, structural servicing solutions to it and to make it work. Because, I mean, Jonathan, you know, absolutely understand your problem of trying to find land in a borough. They've traditionally, the single story shed is a big single story footprint taking up loads of land in your borough. And lots of resi developers have been sweeping them away and building resi on top. And then they'll give you a little like maker space, which is anathema to Prologis and Segro and people. What's a maker space? That's not proper industrial. That's just somebody making some pots. We get that. So we start with, you know, 10 meters clear high, 30 meter deep yards, 15 meter max or minimum column and spans, and design a shed like that. And then we design residential to work with that as well. And we're working with JVs, so we've got industrialists and residential people working together on this, and that's the partnership that you need to bring together. I'm talking too much. We've got a presentation I'm happy to share with any of you if you want to message me to show you a bit more. But it is challenging, and we know that. But then the problem is big, and we've got to solve it. And we believe we're finding ways. We've got stuff going through to planning, 80,000 square foot sheds with 800 resi units integrated to it. We've got 2 of those going on at the moment, and many others.
I mean, I'm conscious probably it'd be helpful to have an offline debate, but I think probably the bit that I find quite interesting is in terms of the role of the London plan. It really should give us a bit more guidance in terms of quality of space, because there is this big pot of floor space, and it's all things to all men. We might need some maker space, but we also need some proper sheds. And I think there probably is a balance there somewhere that you can compromise it. But I think my overarching concern is that sort of we want to attract institutional investors into the borough. So we've got to comply with sort of institutional lending covenants. And as soon as we get into sort of mixed title, party walls, sinking funds, etc., the whole idea of mixing is just a bit of a nightmare. But as I say, I don't think we can solve the problem today. But sort of the interesting thing is, I think there's part solutions for everybody, but there's probably not a solution that globally works across the board. But there's bits and pieces that we can all move forward on. But yeah, no, it's an interesting conundrum, isn't it?
There's several people on this debate. So if there's something you want to say, you've not said it yet, just put your name in the chat box and say I want to say something, and we'll come to you. Otherwise, I might have to single some of you out and bully you into having a say on this. I'm just going to another question into the hat, which is this: London can't be the only global city that's got this problem in terms of the confliction between rising prices, land supply, scarcity, housing, etc. You know, I'm thinking of the New Yorks, the Hong Kongs of this world. So have they got a similar problem? And if they have, has anybody got any experience of how they're resolving it? Because you're all global companies, you must operate in those spaces as well. I've seen a hand come straight up from Tom. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, sorry to take up too much airspace, but New York's been doing it for 100 years. The Grand Central Station is an industrial infrastructure space with a hotel above it, office above that, and resi above that. Hong Kong, Singapore have been doing multi-level industrial with other uses on the lower levels or next to them for a very long time as well. Those are different cities from London. They're all high-rise, but they got high-rise because they were short of space in the footprint. We're a low-rise city in London. But the issue is just, if you like, in its infancy, and maybe this will just grow over the next 100 years, or maybe we'll cap London and say it can't be any taller. But as long as there are people wanting to trade and live in London, these issues will continue, and we need to do need to find kind of resolutions for them.
No, I know a lot of people will say, well, you know, high prices, we shouldn't have stuff like this, these great big sheds in the centre of London. Put them out the M25 and just rock. There's plenty of land next to the motorway. Nobody wants to live next to a motorway, but you can put your warehouses there. So what's the problem with just all the logistics being via the M25? Why is that a problem? Why do you need to be close to centre? Is it because switching to EV, it doesn't work? What are the problems associated with that? Ollie, I'm looking at you for that one.
Okay, didn't want to monopolise the conversation. So I think it is a sustainability point that I talked about. You know, just to have all the vehicles, trying to access central London from the M25. And let's not forget, when you get out towards the M25, there's large amounts of green belt and the like. Which actually brings me on to a point which is connected to what we were just talking about as well in terms of multi-story. Is that what we do see is, there is significant constraints on land assembly, appropriate size, with the road and power infrastructure around them to handle the very intensive nature of a multi-story building. If you think about the highways impact, we've all had our challenges getting a single story scheme through our planning system. Well, multiply that by 4 or 5 into a single location on the road network, and you can see a real problem. And you did mention the other overseas sort of locate, where they do it elsewhere. I think you will find, they are normally very strategically planned sites. They're not just reliant on developers doing a bit of land assembly. I think London has a role to play in identifying and in creating sites that you need to be kind of onto a dual carriageway with a large rectangular shaped site. So I would like to see perhaps a bit more strategic thinking in terms of if that is the future. How do we identify those sites to allow that intensification of use? Because, as I say, we're in a lot of situations where we look to go multi-story or look at the potential, the surrounding infrastructure just won't support it.
I didn't see much in the way of logistics mentioned in the planning white paper. Is that a concern for the industry? Who would like to answer that question? Marcus is online, so I'm going to try and single out Marcus here to join the debate. Marcus, the government doesn't seem to be commenting on anything other than housing. Does the government realise how important logistics is? You think they would have done with the personal protection equipment and everything else at the start of this pandemic? Does the government need to wake up to the problem we've got? You can unmute yourself, Marcus, and answer that question. I don't think Marcus is going to join the debate, so I'm going to go back to Jonathan on that one. What's your view on that, Jonathan?
I think there's no votes in sheds, are there? There's votes in houses. That's the problem.
I like that. I like that one. I like that one down. Go on.
No, I mean it's a historic problem with the planning system, isn't it? That the planning system has always been driven around. There's a methodology for residential population growth, and there's a methodology for retail. And I used to be a retail planner and churned out studies every day of the week showing how many more shopping centres and retail sheds we needed. But there's never really been much of a methodology for offices in industrial. So there's never really been an ingrained methodology for it. And I suppose it's the interesting point, really, is it because I suppose 10 years ago retail was the UK's economy, and I guess now it's got a little bit more sophisticated, and logistics is that driver. And I suppose you can see the dilemma with government generally in terms of when it comes to delivering big sort of infrastructure projects such as HS2, etc., it's not really geared up for it. And there's always been frustration when they introduced that legislation to deal with infrastructure projects that sort of that's not really quite worked. Airports hasn't really quite worked. It's sort of if you're a student of planning, it's sort of there's a cascade of issues. But I suppose in terms of sort of practicality, I mean, I think the fundamental thing is it's a bit frustrating that the London plan really kind of has done a reasonably good job in terms of doing the distribution, and it's been quite rigid on protecting employment land, which is fundamentally a good thing. And I think it's now been fiddled with the politicians, and then we've got this sort of messy approach. And I think the interesting dilemma we've got is that my reading of it is that there's quite a lot of inertia in the GLA in terms of it was their plan, and come what may, they're going to still introduce it, even if the Secretary of State's told them otherwise. And I think the frustration then really for the market is that sort of kind of all the market wants is certainty. They just kind of, what's the deal? What can we get on with? They don't want to get involved in these sort of academic debates. They just want to sort of do their scheme, get in and get out and make a bit of money. And I think that's the hugely frustrating thing for everybody, is that the whole process just gets muddier by the day, and everybody's jobs gets more complicated. And then you layer in a bit of environmental restrictions on top of it, and you kind of wonder why you bother getting out of bed most days. But I'm not sure if that's a complete balanced answer. But I sort of, coming back to the point, the housing need is quite acute, so that does need to be addressed. But it's understanding that all functions as part of a wider economy, and we need to balance retail, logistics, employment, community, health, etc. And the politicians are so fiddled with the system of recent that sort of all those tools have been lost, and more and more obligations are put on local authorities, and they've got less and less skilled resource to solve it. So more and more work for consultants and agents.
Now, if I was a politician, I would think, well, wait a minute, these are all just dirty lorries and vans polluting my London borough. They can go somewhere else, because there's a bit of an image issue with logistics, isn't there? I mean, what is logistics doing in terms of the clean air agenda for London? London knows it's got to do something about the pollution to keep its crown as one of the top global cities. Is logistics doing enough to convert to EV and reducing the number of trips around the centric part of London? Who wants to answer that question? Ollie, I'll go back to you on that one. Clean vehicles, EV, are we doing enough?
I was just waiting for Andrew to come in there and
I'll go to the next.
share his thoughts, but I would be interested to get his thoughts on that. But I think, as we, the previous panel and our research shows, I think the sector will really perform in this area in the next few years, because they're investing heavily, and they will invest much more heavily than the general public or the general population. The take up of electric vehicles, I think, will be much slower than actually what you see in the logistics industry. Of course, the biggest challenge is obviously HGVs, and it might be electric HGVs, it might be alternative low carbon fuels, but we're probably still a little way away in terms of the HGV movement, HGVs being electrified. But technology is moving fast. But I do think, in terms of more urban delivery vehicles, vans, lighter goods vehicles, I think there's going to be a big change. I think that's going to really help the image of the sector, and I think that will hopefully be really helpful. And also, there's just a little bit generally about the form of development and what our buildings look like, and what an industrial park looks like, because also I think London in particular has some sort of quite legacy industrial areas, which at the time no thought went into green amenity spaces, things that sort of Tom we're talking about. They're not nice places to be, and I don't think that helps. But when you look at a new industrial park, logistics park, that they are quite pleasant places with green spaces, nice environments to work in. And part of the challenge in London is, Prologis in the Midlands, we can go and buy a 200-acre site and create a park environment like that. Of course, ownership is much more fragmented in London, so it's like a Park Royal where everyone owns 4 or 5 acres. How do you bring those principles in? And there's got to be, I guess, again, there's got to be more cooperation and collaboration, because it's more difficult to solve when it's in multiple ownerships. But I think that will help, and I think that is changing as well.
We've only got a couple of questions going very quickly. Did you want to add anything to that? 30 seconds.
I was going to just say, yeah, we've we've gone on with electric vehicles and the like, and we are trying to. The issue, as we were sort of alluding to, is the further out you are, the efficiency of the vehicles becomes more of an issue. So hence why you need to be closer in to do that for those electric vehicles. Colleagues of mine have always said that the way that will go is once it's legislated, because it's not necessarily the big firms, they'll make an impact on it, but it's everybody who else is going in as well. So, you know, it's not going to be those big firms who are doing it, it's all the smaller firms who are in there. And until it's legislated on, it's that cost perspective will then start undercutting you because they can run it cheaper than you can. So there's going to be an element of that will have a bearing on it. But we're trying to do that. But say it all comes down to finding those places in the right place to do it.
Andrew, how do you see the cost? I was just wondering actually, because you know, with electric vehicles, you've got your upfront cost, which is higher than a diesel engine at a vehicle at the moment, but then your running cost is lower. So how do you guys see that balance? Is it cost effective to run electric vehicles compared to a diesel vehicle yet? How does that sort of
in places like London? Yes, yeah, because there's shorter trips in general. Where we're further afield, then not so effective. But certainly in over shorter distances, because you've got 90 miles, 100-mile range where you're stopping, starting, it's not so bad. So the cost is coming down. The vehicles are getting more efficient. They're going to get cheaper over time. At the moment, it's still a little bit too expensive on that front to completely change the fleet, but it's slowly getting that way, slowly balancing itself out.
Okay, we're virtually out of time. I'd like to thank everybody for joining this session. My conclusions are space is very hard to find in London, the West End, and the city's becoming increasingly difficult to service. It's affordability of space, housing competing, logistics. Electric vehicles are probably the future, but there's an issue with range and infrastructure. The London plan is too detailed, but at least it does try and protect strategic industrial locations. Good debate about multi-story and about beds over sheds. There probably are solutions there somewhere along the line, and you don't get any votes from sheds. Thanks everybody for joining this session, and we'll go back and join the main auditorium. Thank you everybody who's contributed. Bye now.
Thanks.